All right, this is Chapter 2, Introduction to Criminology, Measuring Crime. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about all the stuff. Actually, I'm going to do my best to make it brief, but I literally teach an entire class about just this chapter, so I will try to keep it brief. But basically, in the chapter, they're going to talk about identifying key features and limitations of the Uniform Crime Report. Like, what is that? What's the UCR? What's it good for? What's it not great for? We'll talk about supplementary homicide reports, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, like what is a hate crime and how are those statistics managed. We'll look at some, again, features and limitations of things like the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey, and then distinguish the differences between the UCR and the NCVS. And then, of course, just talk about like data collection in general, because I feel like we might not all be doing this kind of research out there in the field. It can be good to, be clear about what we're talking about. All right, so let's jump in. It's important as we talk about, understanding data. First of all, to understand and develop theories, we have to have empirical research to ground ourselves, right? We have to understand what's going on out there. And the reality is that there's this thing called the dark figure of crime, right? Meaning this is, as you see on the slide here, it's the unreported and unrecorded crimes that do not find their way into the three crime reporting systems, the UCR, the NCVS, or self-reported studies. And so that means that for any particular crime, there's a certain percentage that we just really don't know about. Like the people either don't report the crime or, we don't find those offenders. And so that means what we really know about crime is really just coming from the tip of that iceberg. The people that are caught, the people that are, or the crimes that are reported. And so the real, challenge for someone within the field of criminal justice or a criminologist is, how do we really understand the dark figure of crime? How do we illuminate what we're not seeing, right? So a lot of our patterns are coming from just what we can see at the top there. And so just methodologically, that means we could be missing a lot of stuff by not understanding what's under the surface there, right? Okay, so let's jump in. Why do we measure crime? Well, we got to. Right. First up, it's necessary just to understand why is it occurring. And then, of course, there's a lot of programs and policies that are informed by this research. Right. So, for instance, let's say you have a program that's supposed to reduce drug use. Right. You have to have a way to evaluate that. Is it actually working or not? Like, for instance, very famously, the DARE program. Which was introduced in junior high schools for many years. I myself went through that program. And empirically, it didn't work. It didn't actually reduce the incidence of drug taking or drug using for the generations that experienced it. So doing a program evaluation would be to say, we're spending money. We only have a limited amount of money to deal with things like criminal justice. How do we make sure we're giving the resources to stuff that works, right? Or let's say we have certain policies in place, like we'll talk about 3 strikes laws later on. California was one of the first states to have a very different kind of 3 strikes law, where the third strike didn't have to be a violent felony. It could just be any crime. And how that policy dramatically impacted the amount of people who were incarcerated for 25 to life for often minor crimes like stealing a bicycle. And how that then caused this, huge overpopulation crisis within prisons that then had to lead to other policies and issues. So sometimes it's a matter of, okay, we're doing this policy. Does it actually work? How do we make sure that it's not causing all sorts of other unintended consequences? So we have to really look at these things in rigorous, thoughtful, scientific ways to measure this stuff. So measuring crime is also needed for risk assessment. That's a whole nother thing, right? Basically, as we talked about a little bit in chapter 1, the idea of, victimology and trying to understand, who's at risk and who's not in certain situations. How do we then limit that? And then, of course, another reason to measure crime is to identify the causes that require differences in crime rates that can be related to differences in people and in their situations, right? Meaning it can be differences about, let's say, potentially sex is one of those ones, right? When it comes to, or at least the binary understandings of sex, when it comes to men and women, there are certain criminal patterns that differ. When it comes to age, that's another factor, right? So when you think about those personal characteristics, things like age, that can dramatically impact your likelihood of committing a crime. We'll talk about it later, but there's this concept of desistance, that we tend to age out of crime, or that the majority of crimes are being done by young people. So understanding those differences and how they relate to different people can help us either prevent crime or also just better understand it. So counting crime is also used to evaluate and justify those programs and policies that are trying to address the criminal activity and make sure that it's actually doing something. So we'll talk a lot about different theories and how they have certain policy implications that come from those theories, such as, I'm sure you've heard of like scared straight programs that are supposed to be to, basically as a deterrent. Like you're a young offender, you go into a prison situation and someone treats you horribly, so it's supposed to make you like reform so you don't go to prison. But the idea is, the logic of it kind of makes sense, but there's no empirical proof that it works, meaning you can go through and look at research of people that have been subjected to those programs and say, are they then less likely to end up in prison? And we just do not have the data to support that. So having a way to vigorously, in an empirical way, measure and understand these things makes it so we can sort out the fact from the fiction, or if what we think makes sense to work versus what actually happens in practicality. And this is something we'll talk about a lot in this class in regards to the war on drugs, which from one perspective of the politicians makes some kind of loose amount of sense. I mean, really, it's for them to get reelected. That's a whole other thing. But from an actual practical policy consideration, what has it actually done and what other consequences have resulted because of it? We'll talk about that too. Okay, so looking at where do we get the data? Where is all this information coming from? Well, crime data, primarily a lot of research uses the Uniform Crime Reports. So this is coming from, all the, basically, the ways in which I shouldn't say all, which many crimes are classified and reported to the UCR, so it can give us certain ideas. But the UCR doesn't have every crime, right? And this is something that's kind of data-based and controlled by the FBI. And it really matters how they define things as well, and that's going to affect the data itself. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So there's different kinds of classifications of offenses within the UCR. You have Part 1 crimes, which are like what they consider things like murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, larceny, burglary, which we'll talk about later. The lines between those kind of things are really often about how much money is involved or what kind of breaking or entering is involved. Motor vehicle theft, and then arson was added to Part 1 crimes by Congress in 1978. And then Part 2 crimes are things like forgery and counterfeiting, vagrancy, fraud, gambling, embezzlement, drunkenness, stolen property, whether you buy it, receive it, or possess it, DUIs, or any other driving under the influence, vandalism, violations of liquor laws, possessions or carrying weapons, offenses against children or families, prostitution, or any other commercialized vice, human trafficking, sex offenses other than rape or prostitution, involuntary servitude that also kind of falls under the banner of human trafficking, which can also involve commercialized sex acts, drug abuse violations, motor vehicle theft, and basically like suspicion of stuff, or even like there's other offenses kind of under there, like curfew or loitering stuff. And so the idea is that the FBI classifies and scores crimes, in a way to kind of better understand, and again, collects this data from all sorts of different municipalities so that it can then be analyzed in a larger way. And this is like an incredible resource for criminal justice researchers, because we want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what's going on, and then we can connect that to other factors in certain areas. The real goal of the UCR is to generate consistent sets of crime statistics that can be used by law enforcement or their administrations, and really for their own operation and management, but researchers also use it as a way to kind of figure out what's going on themselves. So there are a fair amount of limitations of the UCR, meaning some crimes are just not collected by the UCR, so you can't really research that or understand it. It's going to kind of cause a hole in what you know. Also, the UCR concentrates on conventional street crime, but does not really adequately involve other serious types of offenses like corporate crime. So there's kind of the bias impact of some of this stuff. The UCR can be used for political purposes. That's a whole nother problem. Sometimes law enforcement agencies either unintentionally make errors in what they report, or like on purpose do not submit delinquent reports that don't really fulfill all the information that they're supposed to give over. So for instance, there was a recent study, I think it was in 2019 or 2020, that was looking at how when an outside organization really tried to do their own research about officer-involved shootings, how there was a huge discrepancy between what was happening in local areas and what was being reported to the UCR. See, the idea is that if they are not reporting the data correctly or at all, then that's obviously going to affect the way that we can even do research or understand what we're looking at, right? So obviously that can be problematic because you're kind of expecting the law enforcement themselves to report these things, or just even for more practical reasons. Like for instance, in my family violence class, we talk about how sometimes there's just data limitations that happen from the way things are reported. So for instance, if we're trying to understand something like familicide, like where someone, kills their family and then kills themselves, there's actually very specific differences between like when a mother does that to her family, when a father does that, when a sibling does that to the family. And so there's even like different terms for it and all sorts of fun stuff. But anyway, how can we really better understand those very specific kinds of crimes when oftentimes the way they're reported to things like national databases like the UCR are just as homicide? And they're not putting in there, well, familicide, patricide, right? This is being done. The father kills the family then himself or something like that. So that's just one example, but from the family violence perspective, it's really difficult to get that specific information from these national databases, and so it impedes what kind of research can be done to illuminate some of these dark corners of really negative things in society that we need to address. So anyway, also, like I said, it can just be clerical problems, like people could just enter things in wrong. So that can be a problem. And then changes in the legal code also make it really difficult to compare things once they change, right? So like once the law changes, all your reporting previous to that, it can now no longer be compared to that new, the subsequent crime reports after that legal code has changed. So that can then affect being able to do things like longitudinal studies and say, hey, over the last 30 years, how much has, this particular crime changed within this area or whatever it might be. So obviously that's problematic, but again, it still has a lot of information, and it is kind of a goldmine for criminal justice researchers, but it's really just there more for the administration management of the criminal justice system by the criminal justice system itself in a way. But really, yeah, it's something that, is a lot of data for a lot of researchers. Okay, then you have supplementary homicide reports. So this was developed in the 1960s by the FBI, and the goal of the supplementary homicide reports is to collect additional information pertaining to homicide incidents, such as the details of murder victims and offenders, their relationships to one another, like was this a spouse, was this a friend, an ex-lover, a co-worker, right, things like that, what weapon was used, and the circumstances in each criminal homicide. And this is really key in developing policy related to homicide. The more details we have, the more we can understand some of the patterns that emerge. So this is also used to enhance understandings of, some of the trends that might change over time, right, as maybe different policy changes happen, they have ripple effects in society, or even sometimes just, social standings or, different amounts of access to different crimes really changed. Like, for instance, the rate of women committing corporate crimes was pretty low when women were legally restricted from a lot of corporate America jobs, right? So it makes sense as women were given more access to those jobs, then there's more likelihood of corporate crimes coming from women, right? That makes sense. So, there's other kind of ways that patterns and trends are really understood through these kind of supplementary reports. So, that was kind of the forerunner to what we now have that's called the National Incident-Based Reporting System. That's a little bit more complex. So by 2013, the NIBRS collects data on each incident and arrest within 23 offense categories. And so this consists of 49 specific crimes. And basically, at least that's for Group A, there's 10 for Group B. You don't need to know the specifics. There's a table in the book. But basically, the idea is the goal of the NIBRS is to enhance the quality, the quantity, and the timeliness of crime statistical data, and then to improve the methodology used for compiling, analyzing, auditing, and publishing collected crime data. Why is that important? Because why go through all the effort of doing all that research and your data's faulty, or your conclusions are faulty because they're based on limited data, right? We don't want to spend the time and the energy doing this stuff to not know what we're looking at. So that's kind of the big deal there. So finding better ways to have this information is just really, really, really important to having better ideas of the picture of what we're looking at, so we can kind of start to chip away at this that we're talking about, that dark figure of crime, to try and understand what am I looking at. Okay, let's see. I guess we don't really have to go into too much of the details of the NIBRS, other than limitations is important to know. Just like with the UCR, there are limitations because it's only including crimes reported to law enforcement. So anything unreported or unrecorded is not going to be included. And, also because of the specifications developed by a federal agency, local agencies might find it difficult to work with the certain specific, or the specifications of how they're supposed to report it and how they're supposed to tally this information, which might be different than the way that it's understood within their area. And then a lot of different organizations have different goals and incentives, and that can affect the kind of data reporting. So while it has more details in the UCR, there's also that drawback that currently little is known about the extent of errors that are happening when collecting that kind of data. So that's a whole nother problem. All right, moving on to hate crime statistics. This came about as a result of the Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1990, which says that, we should collect data about crimes that manifest evidence of prejudice. And that can be based on things like race, religion, sexual orientation, or ethnicity. And this was amended later on in 1994 to include both physical and mental disabilities as well. And so they provide additional information to the traditional UCR by talking about, specifically hate crime incidents. So what was the location of the incident? What was the victim type? Meaning, was it an individual? Was it a business? Was it, sometimes, like, think about hate crimes, it could be something like a house of worship, right? Something like that, like someone goes and destroys a synagogue or bombs a church, or, threatens a particular mosque or something like that. So sometimes it's the victim type itself isn't an individual as much as it's like a cemetery or a building or a business. Also, there's number of offenders that's taken into account, the race of the offenders, and any sort of bias motivation that they might have, right? So categories of bias motivation include race, ethnicity, national origin. And again, I should back up and say this is perception of, right? Because things like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender expression, these are things that are like people interpret them of us, and they're not as cut and dry as people think. So for instance, right after 9/11, when there was a lot of anti-Islamophobia and people were targeting people that were, members that were of the Muslim faith, there was actually a lot of people that were of the Sikh faith or other kind of, other faiths of the Middle East that basically were also targeted falsely because people didn't understand the cultural differences there, right? So sometimes you're not even a member of that group, right? So sometimes people have been beaten for being perceived as gay and they're not even gay, right? Or something of that nature. But it doesn't matter if the person really is or not. It's the perception and the bias, the hate that motivates targeting a person based on who they are, such as, again, a sexual orientation, gender expression, religion, their disabilities, anything like that. So that's, something that's compiled as well. And then something that also gives us an ability to track trends over time. So you can see kind of like when there's backlashes towards particular groups or like targeting of, like, for instance, in recent years, we've seen a lot of uptick in hate crimes against Asians because of the COVID-19 pandemic, or against transgendered individuals, largely because of the horrible rhetoric in society. Okay. And then lastly here for crime data from law enforcement agencies is law enforcement officers killed and assaulted statistics, or LEOCA, that is also collected by the FBI. And it began in 1972. It collects data from agencies on officer line of duty deaths for, things like line of duty death, felonious death, or accidental deaths, which also unfortunately happen sometimes. And so, all these agencies that do participate with this, information, report on officers who were killed or assaulted that meet the following criteria. Either they worked in an official capacity, they have full arrest powers, they were, oftentimes it's that they were wearing a badge or carrying a firearm and being paid by the government to, basically to represent the people in some law enforcement capacity. So that's, a lot of data that we have that's all coming from law enforcement agencies. That's a lot of stuff, but you can see how each one's a little bit different and they slice a little bit differently in like what they're collecting and what we can understand from them. Okay, moving on to crime data from victims of crime themselves, not from law enforcement agencies. So the National Crime Victimization Survey, or the NCVS, is one of those ways that we try to fill in the gap, or that, kind of dark figure of crime that we don't really know, by trying to parcel out some of the stuff that wasn't reported to police. Right? So again, just like it says here, to provide additional insight. So anything that wasn't reported. And, why do people not report these crimes to law enforcement? Well, there's a lot of reasons that can be. Some victims feel like nothing's going to be done anyway, so why go through the process of this, right? Some victims feel that the crime is not important enough to report to police. Like, for instance, let's say their bike is stolen or something minor. They might not even report it because they're like, oh, what's the point? And especially because if they've had negative interactions with law enforcement before that just kind of say, yeah, there's nothing we can really do, that can really negatively impact just even reaching out and reporting these crimes. Sometimes victims perceive the incident is too private or too personal, meaning we are humans, we have pride, right? And being a victim of a crime, especially if it's a crime related to the body or something personal, can be humiliating, can be emotionally, psychologically devastating, right? Whether it's, an old person being victimized because they're not as physically agile, or maybe someone being sexually assaulted because they're not, because they were basically just considered a victim, or whatever it might be. That can often be a situation where people don't want to have to get into the details of these things. And especially knowing that as they report a crime like that, they're going to dig into their history and their background. So let's say, you are someone who is a sex worker and you are sexually assaulted. What's the likelihood, do you think, that you're going to get justice in that kind of situation? It's probably pretty low, right? Largely because we have a negative social assessment of people that are sex workers. And there's this idea that, because that's your profession, that somehow that doesn't inoculate you from, that they basically like, well, that's just a risk of the profession, which it obviously is not. That's horrible. There's a very strong difference between transactional sex work and being sexually assaulted, but it makes sense that that could then really impact, whether or not people report it. Or again, if it's just something that is really personal, people might not want to speak about those things or really have ways to kind of bring that up. Or if the victim just think that police would not want to be inconvenienced with the crime. I remember one time working at a public library, which I still work at because I'm an idiot, many, many moons ago. It was this weird thing where, like, for a couple years there, teens would show up at the library to fight each other. Like, like, I'll meet you at the flagpole after school, but they'd, like, come to the library of all places. I'm like, that's super random. Probably because it was empty. But anyway, I just remember there being a brawl in one of the rooms once where, this kid got hit really hard and he fell and he hit his face on the shelf and it just like cracked his eyebrow open. He's bleeding everywhere. And so I called the cops and they basically convinced the parents of these kids just to not file charges or anything because it's not going to be a thing, whatever. So you see sometimes those kind of incidents take place that can really impact people to think, well, cops aren't really going to do anything anyway. It's just going to be a hassle. Why even report it? But it's important to still understand why these crimes took place, what happened, what were the dimensions, who was involved, all of that kind of stuff. So the NCVS is really intended to identify portions of the population that are at risk for victimization, to also estimate multiple victimization rates, and provide data that's needed to evaluate crime prevention programs, and really allow for comparisons of patterns, or let's say like amounts of certain crimes that happen or the locations where the crimes happen. And you can use that information to compare with the UCR that are reported to see what's going on there. So that's how we know things like sexual assault or rape are some of the lowest reported crimes, because we see very high rates of reporting in things like the NCVS, but very low rates in the UCR. And then when we could look at that culturally from a criminological perspective, we can say, well, how do we then live in a rape culture that often blames victims of crimes for their own victimization instead of, or almost justify the rapes against them, instead of punishing or making deviant the offenders themselves, right? So that's where the culture stuff comes in, and that's the fun sociology stuff we'll be talking about. Okay, so, law enforcement agencies use the NCVS, and so do researchers. So law enforcement uses it to kind of enhance citizen cooperation with officials in deterring and detecting crime. Like, they want to know why people aren't reporting so that they can kind of minimize those barriers, so people feel comfortable too. So again, not to go into too much depth, but just side example. There used to be a situation within California where they found through these kind of data reports or self-reported surveys that a lot of people that were the victims of violent spousal assaults or sexual assaults were not reporting them to police, largely because of their immigration status, meaning they didn't want to report this person because that person would hold over their head, well, you are not documented, so therefore you're going to end up, in the carceral system or deported or otherwise. So people wouldn't report these abusers would get away with it for a long period of time. And so California passed a law years back to basically grant people a kind of like somewhat temporary-ish protected kind of green card status if they are in a situation where their abuser, or they're being victimized in such a way that they can report it and not have to worry about they themselves being then deported or kind of like put on the radar of immigration services. So why that? Because they realized so much of this crime was taking place and was just not being dealt with. So part of it from law enforcement's perspective is, how do we make sure that people actually want to reach out to the police? How do you also establish different police forces to deal with specific kinds of crimes that the NCVS is saying are most prevalent, right? So having different kinds of cops for different kinds of specialties. Also, from the NCVS, they've done things like, doing projects like, for instance, park lighting programs or street lighting programs in areas where there's high reports of crime rates. And that's really connecting what's reported to what's not reported, because in some of these areas, it might not be reported to law enforcement, but if it's going to the NCVS, they can see that there's clearly an issue within those areas. So who's eligible to take or to fill out the NCVS? It's anyone over the age of 12 living in the US. The information that they ask them for is data about themselves, like some demographic variables. What's their age? What's their sex? What's their race? What's their ethnicity? Are they married? What's their income or education level? And then, of course, for offenders, they're interested in the sex, the race, an approximate age, because it's not like the person necessarily hands you their ID and tells you exactly how old they are, or what kind of relationship might be happening between the victim and the offender. Is this a stranger? Is this a coworker? Is this, a fellow student in class? Is this, kind of those kind of things. And then specifically, they look at the crimes themselves. What took place? Where? When? Like the time and place is important. Were there weapons involved? What were the kind of injuries potentially that were sustained? And what kind of economic consequences resulted from that victimization? So victims' experiences with the criminal justice system is also important that they want to kind of understand. Did they use any sort of self-protective measures? Or, are there issues of potential substance abuse by those offenders? All of that kind of stuff is being taken into account there. Some of the limitations of the NCVS, certain crimes like prostitution, drug dealing, gambling are not going to be revealed in these interviews for obvious reasons. You're like incriminating yourself. Since the NCVS surveys only households, crimes that are happening against businesses or stores or other kind of groups or organizations are just not going to be included. Plus, think about it that way. It's not going to be anyone who's unhoused either, or often even people living in high density like apartment living. So the validity of the NCVS becomes an issue. And validity just means whether or not it's measuring what it thinks it's measuring. So that's, kind of some of the problems with the specific data, but again, it does fill in gaps in what we know about the UCR. Now let's compare the two, right? So they both collect data on the same types of serious crimes, right? But there are some differences. Like, for instance, the UCR only measures rape as a crime against women, or for many, many years, the FBI didn't even consider men to be victims of crime or victims of rape, which is insane because obviously they are as well. But the NCVS measures rape as a crime against anyone. And some of the other differences are each program was developed to serve a very different purpose, right? The UCR is more for the organization of criminal justice itself, versus the NCVS is kind of more to fill in the gaps. The types of crimes that they're looking at are not necessarily identical, so they can't often be compared across cases. They use very, very different methods to collect crime data versus... So the UCR is saying, like, hey, police department, tell me how many of these crimes happen and the details. And the NCVS is saying, fill out this survey, you tell me, self-reported survey. Very different. So they also use different bases to calculate the rates for certain crimes, and they implement different sampling procedures. So that's obviously going to impact the kind of data that you're getting from each one. Okay, so just a little bit here about self-report surveys. There's a lot of these that go out. And again, what's the goal here? Well, just from a methodological perspective, it's to try to understand stuff that you're not getting in other ways, right? And part of this is you want people to just openly answer these things with, tell you the information that you might not be able to get otherwise. So it addresses 4 broad classes of questions: the prevalence of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, changes in attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors over time, differences between groups of people in their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and causal propositions about those attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And again, causal meaning this factor is causing the other, X is causing Y, which is really difficult to do. Oftentimes we can say there's a correlation, meaning these two variables are related to each other. So for instance, when the amount of money you have goes down, the likelihood of homelessness goes up, right? Those two things are related, but they're not causal. meaning some folks have support systems, so even if they have no money, they're not homeless, right? So causal just means like, if X happens, then Y is the result. Harder to prove, as we'll talk about later. So anyway, when looking at the data collection, they collect data by asking respondents to provide information about themselves, meaning they ask them, have you engaged in certain illegal behaviors? And it's interesting, I have a couple colleagues that work specifically with this kind of data, that as demographers, and it's kind of fascinating, right? Because this is the kind of information that you can't really get otherwise. So it's important to collect people's, what they're willing to tell you about these things. And this is why methodologically it's important that people feel that it's completely anonymous, right, and confidential, so that none of the information is tracked back to them. Okay, let's see. So this can be collected through questionnaires or in-person interviews. Types of self-reported surveys, there's a couple different ones. You have Monitoring the Future, that is basically a National Institute of Drug Abuse sponsored self-report survey that collects information about substance and alcohol abuse patterns for youth. So originally it sampled 12th grade students, but for years now they've also included 8th grade, 10th grade, and 12th grade as a way to kind of say, and they'll say things like, have you smoked a cigarette in the last 30 days, yes or no? Then you get the National Household Survey on Drug Abuse that is used annually to collect information on the use of illegal drugs by individuals in the U.S. And this is currently sponsored by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Department of Health and Human Services, and data collection is conducted by the Research Triangle Institute. So it's one of the largest surveys of drug use ever conducted in the U.S., and the data collection is administered through face-to-face interviews with individuals where they live. So the samples include individuals 12 years and older who are residents of households and civilians living on military bases. And then last up here is the National Youth Survey, which was implemented in 1977 by researchers at the University of Colorado, and it's measured in waves. So the first 5 waves were from 1976 to 1980. Wave 6 was 1981 to 83. Wave 7 was 84 to 86, and 8 and 9 was 87 and 94. So this included items that measure respondents' involvement in criminal activity, and it measures over 40 offenses that represent the full range of offenses reported in the UCR. And it also includes measuring respondents' attitudes on issues like community involvement, what kind of educational aspirations they might have, are they pregnant, have they had abortions, what kind of employment skills do they have, what kind of neighborhood problems do they deal with, and do they use drugs and alcohol. So, a lot of this stuff is really looking at kind of having the comfort so people can very accurately or, openly talk about what they've experienced so that we can get a better picture of these things. Instead of criminalizing or making them deviant, we really need to know this information, right? So some of these are self-reports about delinquency when it comes to the National Youth Surveys. Some are parental appraisals of what they think their children are doing, and then youth's internal appraisals of themselves from their parents, their friends, their teachers' perspectives. Like what do they think the teachers think of them? What do they think their parents think of them? That kind of stuff. So they're kind of just really interesting ways to, again, collect data. Why are we doing this? So that we have a better understanding of crime and what we're looking at, so we can have better policies and better procedures to deal with it, and hopefully to limit or eliminate these issues.